I do have one more question, and it concerns something that Professor Chang mentioned, sentience, by which I mean not necessarily the ability to answer hard questions, but awareness, something like the capacity to feel pleasure or pain, the capacity to experience the color blue, and so forth. Is this, and I suppose this would be a question for you, really critical for personhood? For example, in order to be empathetic, do I literally have to be feeling something in a subjective sense, or is it sufficient that there's a certain kind of wiring in me that enables me to somehow represent in some non-sentient way what's going on with the other person? And if that's really critical, is there reason to think that a computer would be aware, right, in that sense, irrespective of how smart it was? And would there be any way of knowing? I guess there's a classic philosophical problem called the problem of other minds. Which, how do I know that anybody's conscious? And I assume you are because you're like me and I'm conscious. So, well, because you look like me. You're a human being like me. So anyway, how fundamental is consciousness to personhood on your view, and what are the prospects for a conscious machine?
Okay, so at my lab at MIT, we avoided the term consciousness like the plague because you ask 5 people on the street, you get 7 different definitions. And by the way, Dan Dennett was part of our group, and he was not allowed to use that term. So we much rather chose the term self-awareness because self-awareness, there are a couple of tests. One is, can someone recognize themselves in the mirror? By now, at first was only chimps that we thought could do it. So you paint an eyebrow red, you bring a red dot, and then the chimp looks into the mirror and touches his or her eyebrow and the dot so they can clearly recognize themselves in the mirror. By now they have found out that elephants, crows, whales, dolphins, deer, I mean lots and lots and lots of critters, a surprising amount can recognize themselves in the mirror. And I would argue that is certainly a form of self-awareness. By the dogs and cats cannot. So yes, we might think they are really smart. They aren't. But so consciousness is definitely not a criterion. The one test that is really distinguishing us from any other critter so far is, and I mentioned it earlier, the Sally and Ann test. It's basically, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's basically you have 2 girls. You show infants 2 girls, right? One is called Ann. One is called Sally. And Sally has a ball in her hand, and she has a box in front of her, and puts the ball in the box and leaves the room. And then Anne takes the ball out of the box and puts it in her basket, okay? And then the infants are asked, where will Sally look for the ball when she comes back? And up to 36 months of age, the children will invariably say in the basket, in Anne's basket, because they have seen that Anne moved the ball, and they do not have any concept of someone not being aware of that. So they do not have a concept of otherness. And then between 36 and 40 months of age is a very interesting mixed phase. They will point to one and look at the other. Okay? So one part of their system knows, the other one doesn't. Okay? And chimps and orangutans and gorillas make it to that mixed phase. Okay? But then, usually with 40 months of age, children invariably will know, yes, Sally left the room, and so she will not know, even though I know where the ball now is, Sally will not know because she hasn't witnessed it. And that is usually considered to be the beginning of self-awareness in humans. And a robot has passed that test. It's called Leonardo. It is in the MIT Media Lab. It has passed that test. And let me just point out something very interesting, because what is so crucial about that test, and that's an element of that test that is never mentioned, which for me is the most glaring, that means that the very act of self-awareness we humans are so incredibly proud of is also the moment of saying, you are not me. You are different, right? And so self-awareness is rooted in alienation and estrangement, right? And so there comes exactly, so with self-awareness starts the whole rejection of otherness, right? And this is why being in paradise is being like a child, or like a child below 36 months of age, right? Because we are not fully there, and therefore we are not yet critical, and lo and behold, you know, once become self-aware, we start judging, right? And so I don't consider, as you can see, the feat of self-awareness such a big feat, because it causes a lot of grief. And therefore, no, as you can obviously tell, it is not for me necessarily a criterion for personhood.
Let me offer one other comment. It's related, but maybe a point worth making. So there is this really interesting paradox when you start using the term intelligence. So on the one hand, if we think it's a supremely intelligent task that a machine could beat a human in chess, we think, wow, that is the pinnacle of intelligence, or these other games. At the same time, if I took this pen and dropped it on the floor, or I took this notebook and dropped it on the floor, I would realize that as this thing gets closer, it's probably going to fall on the floor. So by analogy, I sort of understand about gravity. I have this sort of sense of gravity. It turns out that a 3-year-old is really good at that. 3 or 4-year-old can sort of figure out that, you know, if they drop something, a plate, the glass, it'll drop on the floor, and they come to that. Turns out it's really hard to teach a computer to do that. So machines at this point don't think by analogy, they think by patterns. And thinking analogically is central to the way in which humans learn. And so in some sense, you might ask the question, maybe I need to have a machine sort of grow up. You know, a machine can't be smart until it's 40 months old or something. It can pass some of these tests. But we expect it to do these smart things like win in chess, and so I have to engineer these very narrow solutions, but I skip some really important stages of what we would consider intelligence, and we would consider learning, and we sort of bypass the important parts, and the machines just aren't there yet.
If I may just, the part of AI which I belong to, which is called embedded or embodied AI, right? We think exactly very opposed to that. So the joke is always then, when Deep Blue beat Kasparov in chess, there was not a robot yet that could put butter on a piece of bread. We would think putting butter on a piece of bread is way simpler than beating chess, and in fact it is much harder. Because when you think about it, you have to see the consistency of the bread, you have to move the knives, and it's very hard. The only reason why we are so darn good at it is because we learn that hand-eye coordination and the rest of it from the moment we are born. So our idea of intelligence is it can only happen when you have a body that senses and interacts with the world continuously. There is no way to build a Watson disembodied machine that will develop intelligence. So different camp, but yes.